Hello, and thank you for joining us for today's webcast on fostering culture continuity during the 3 phases of crisis recovery. This event is part of the SHRM webcast series and one in an ongoing schedule of programs related to the COVID-19 crisis. You can learn about upcoming and on-demand programs from our e-newsletters and the webcast homepage at shrm.org/webcast. SHRM thanks today's sponsor, Achievers, for making this program available to the HR community. And now about today's programs. Estimates of COVID-19 related revenue losses range from the billions to trillions of dollars by the end of this year alone. Today's program will look at actions you can take to optimize organizational culture and employee performance as your organization braces for what's ahead in the economy and in your business. Our event moderator today is Brie Harvey. With introductions complete, I'm going to turn things over to her to get our program underway. Ms. Harvey?
Thanks so much, Mike. As mentioned, I'm Brie Harvey, and a little about me. I spent the first part of my career in talent acquisition and on the training development side of the house, but in my current role as an employee engagement evangelist, I get to write and speak about the story the data tells about employee motivation and how organizations can build people-first cultures that translate into business performance. And I am so happy to be back here with all you SHRM members today and to be joined by one of my personal and professional inspirations, Vanessa Brangwyn. Vanessa, tell us a little bit about you and your role.
Thanks so much, Brie. And hello, everyone. I'm thrilled to be here today as well with all of the SHRM members. And I serve as the Chief Customer Officer at Achievers, where I have the opportunity to lead the most incredible team of customer success professionals and leaders who are really dedicated to developing employee engagement programs for our customers that contribute ultimately to their strategic business objectives and ensure that their employees, the employees of our platform, which today represents approximately 3 million people globally, are seeing the full value. And I couldn't be happier to be part of this discussion and share a little bit more with all of you today on this incredibly important topic. When I'm not thinking about all things recognition and engagement, you can find me chasing my 5-year-old around the house and trying to avoid that painful moment all parents experience around this time. Some of you probably have already guessed correctly that is stepping on those tiny little pieces of Lego. I'm still not quite sure why those hurt so much, but they definitely do.
That does sound painful. One fun fact about Vanessa that I just love to tell is about her transition many moons ago from senior director to VP. She was on her year-long maternity leave from Achievers, and the VP of customer success role opened up. And there was such an overwhelming number of people, a lot of them her peers, who said they wanted Vanessa as their leader, that the executive team called her while on mat leave and were like, sorry to bother you, but we'd really love for you to apply and interview for this job. And the rest is history. But seriously, when has that ever happened? I think it just says so much about the type of person and leader Vanessa is.
Oh, Brie, thanks. But yes, you're right. That was many, many moons ago. So,
okay, that's enough fangirling over here. Before we get into the agenda, I wanted to quickly address the fact that recent estimates about lost revenues due to COVID-19 are in the trillions of dollars by the end of this year alone. Meanwhile, we're experiencing an intensifying sociopolitical situation that is starting to mirror the magnitude of the civil rights movement. There's a lot of heavy stuff going on right now. But if there's one thing all of us can agree 2020 has taught us, it's that priorities can change by the hour. And we've officially entered an era of what the U.S. military calls VUCA, which stands for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. Businesses won't survive without adapting to this reality and VUCA-proofing themselves, because the only constant will continue to be change. And although there's little you can do to influence the macro level conditions of the economy or the external factors impacting the commercials of your organization, there are things you can do to ensure your business becomes more resilient to inevitable future disruptions, which is why I'm so excited for today's discussion, because it's centered around controlling the controllables within HR and spotlighting field-tested solutions that you can apply today to optimize organizational culture and performance as we brace ourselves for what's next. So we're going to start by quickly exploring two different frameworks that might prove useful in your recovery plans, but we'll spend a bulk of the time unpacking the concept of culture continuity and examining how to strengthen it. We'll wrap it up with some key takeaways and then open up the floor for Q&A. So, Vanessa, right now there is a lot of noise in the market about what HR and leaders should be prioritizing. If I see one more blog with work from home tips, I just might scream. So I'd love to start the conversation by taking a step back and having you contextualize the three phases of recovery.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, over the last few months, and one of the things that's really fantastic about my role at Achievers is I have the opportunity to work directly with our customers and the executives, CHROs and CEOs of some incredible organizations. And we've been spending a lot of time talking about how the priorities have shifted for this coming year. And I think one thing that's important to just call out, before we even jump in further, no matter who you are, what organization you represent, is that there is a huge amount of variance in how different organizations and businesses are being impacted. And that variance is significant. So we, not to say that these examples represent everyone, but know that that variance does exist. But today, there are organizations who are experiencing huge hypergrowth. In fact, one of our customers has 30,000 job openings right now that they're struggling to fill. This is in the US. While others, and this is significant as well, have had to do large reductions in staff or furloughs. So it's hard to look at this through one single lens. But what we can say is, regardless of where each company's at in their own journey, most of them are thinking and talking about their recovery in three phases. They might refer to these phases slightly differently or with different names, or the phase itself might have a different length given the industry or the region that they operate in, but all of them roughly map to the same three things. The first being shelter in place, then the reopening, and then finally the post-COVID-19 phase. And just like any other economic recovery in the history of the world, most experts agree that this recovery is not going to be V-shaped. And what I mean by that is it's not as simple as experiencing a dip and then recovery, a nice smooth lines where each stage blends into one another. What we're already starting to see is that there are going to be twists and turns. We're seeing that already in several states in the US. We're seeing that in other places around the world. And to Brie's point, there's just a huge amount of information out there about what HR should be doing and should be prioritizing. And I can empathize with how challenging that must be to decipher and to be, thinking about this on the regular. So in partnership with the Workforce Institute, which is the research arm of Achievers, we've boiled down our findings to two main considerations that need to be taken into account as you're going through this workforce recovery planning process. And it starts with the fact that HR really wants to be grounding their work and accounting for their priorities with basic behavioral science. It is fundamental to evaluating these priorities to really look at what do we know about humans and how we're wired.
Yeah, absolutely. And anyone who's taken a Psych 101 class may recall that back in the 40s, the iconic Abraham Maslow developed such an elegant explanation of human motivation that it's still widely referenced today. In fact, during the economic disruptions of the 2000s, Chip Conley famously applied Maslow's model to the workplace in his book, how great companies get their mojo from Maslow. Great quarantine read, by the way. But he basically simplified it. So at the base is survival. If an employee is concerned about their safety or health, they're not going to be poised to do their best work. But once baseline needs are met, people are wired to crave connection, a sense of belonging and acceptance within their peer group. And once employees have achieved that sense of belonging, they'll seek self-actualization through meaning and purpose within their work. Amazon recently released some interesting consumer insights that showed they've seen an astronomical surge in search terms for a new category they coined panic pantry, with a 230% uptick in searches for disinfectant wipes, which I think is telling about how many employees have slipped into survival mode. Thinking about what space your employees occupy on the pyramid is relevant, because the higher up you go, the stronger employee engagement and performance tends to be.
Yeah, so true, Brie. And, I want to just call out, at the risk of sounding potentially like a tone-deaf executive, that in the conversations I'm having with customers and organizations, it's important also to call out that regardless of the challenges where they're encountering as a business or where each organization is in their recovery efforts, it doesn't change the reality that the bottom line still matters, and it matters a lot. The level of performance your employees exhibit over these next 6 to 12 months will deeply shape how you bounce back. And that's something that we all need to be thinking about, while also ensuring that those foundational needs are met. So the goal for each stage should be to get employees out of that survival mode as quickly as possible and keep them out so you can focus on the initiatives that promote those that state of emotional well-being and ultimately engagement. And this brings us to our second consideration. So in addition to the behavioral science piece, we want to also make sure that we're examining each phase of the recovery through the 3 environments that employees experience. Brie, this is something you've written a lot about, and I imagine a lot of the SHRM members and our friends listening in are familiar with what that employee experience is and the 3 environments it manifests. But it'd be helpful to quickly explain what we mean by this.
Yeah, for sure. So when we talk about the 3 layers or environments of the employee experience, we're really referring to the cultural, which is how a person feels at work. That entails everything from what behaviors get recognized or punished to how flat or tall your hierarchy structures are perceived to be. For years, culture was thought to be the sole aspect of an employee's experience, but we now know it's a lot less one-dimensional, and it also has a technological layer, which encompasses all the tools an employee needs to do his or her job, as well as a physical layer, which factors in everything from the chair you're sitting in right now to how long your commute is. And under this lens, it's clear that although the physical health and safety component of the employee experience is fundamentally important to tackle with a high sense of urgency, it's also a hygiene factor. Meeting those baseline needs is necessary, not just because you have the obligation to protect your employees, but because otherwise they're unable to tap into those higher levels of motivation associated with creativity, resilience, and peak performance.
Such a good point, Brie. I think when I think about hygiene factors, I think another really good example of how this manifests is through our compensation strategies. So if, for example, if we're paying people too little and they're stressed about how they're going to feed their families, we're not going to cultivate a high performance culture. But at the same time, if we're paying way over market value, it's not going to necessarily result in increased performance. These things have a ceiling. And hygiene factors ultimately are just the starting point for your performance strategy. They can't typically enhance engagement, but what's interesting is they can certainly detract from it or distract from it. Both very true. So regardless of which phase of the recovery each of you are in, it's important to consider where your employees sit on this hierarchy of needs and think about those layers of the employee experience that Brie reviewed with us, and understand that although that top priority should always be to maintain the physical health and safety of your employees, it really is just the starting point to drive the type of engagement and performance that your organization is going to need to really move the business forward.
Yes, which is why we're going to spend the rest of the conversation exploring what best-in-class organizations are doing to enhance the cultural and technological layers of the employee experience by focusing on culture continuity, which begs the question, Vanessa, what is culture continuity and why should it rank on HR's list of priorities at a time when everyone's being forced to do more with less?
Yeah, such a great point. And I'm so glad you asked the question, not only because the majority of our program focuses on this, but I think it's important to really understand what we mean by this term. The Workforce Institute has done a lot of interesting work on what culture continuity, is, and how to build it in these conditions, especially in these conditions. And they define culture continuity as the extent to which an organization maintains culture alignment during a critical event. And while culture alignment is the extent to which a company knows what its cultural values are and aligns everything it does to these cultural values, understanding why maintaining culture continuity is so relevant in these specific conditions and in these specific times is a matter of just looking at the history books. I know for many of us, myself included, this pandemic may feel like a once-in-a-lifetime event, but there's a great deal of research on crisis and change management that highlights how organizations have successfully prevailed through all kinds of disruptive events in our history. That could be natural disasters, mergers and acquisitions, economic impacts, terrorist attacks, the list could go on. Gallup did some really fascinating research that analyzed organizational performance amid the 2008 crash, and unsurprisingly found that when organizations were able to effectively rally their employees around their values, they experienced much higher customer advocacy, productivity, and lower employee turnover. So these actions that we're taking now have significant impact on the bottom line. Unsurprisingly, Gallup was also able to show that the combination of unstable economic conditions and a lack of alignment and purpose were associated with an increase in highly disengaged employees, more customer complaints, losses of revenue, and ultimately struggles across the organization.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to think about what distinguished successful from unsuccessful companies during the 2008 crash. There's definitely some similarities there, but what you're talking about is also kind of common sense. I think that James Harder said it best in that in good times, value alignment and engagement makes the difference between good and great, but in bad times, it can mean the difference between survival and not.
Absolutely.
And I'm sure too, like a lot of people listening to this, like the concept of culture continuity may seem on some level like we're stating the obvious. Like, if leaders are able to effectively inspire and rally people around purpose and shared goals and values, of course, employees are going to be more bought in, and it's going to translate to brand equity and so on. But right now, Vanessa, as you know firsthand, being an executive of a large global organization, there are a lot of legitimate, time-sensitive competing priorities. How attainable is it to get there? Is culture continuity one of those HR initiatives that sounds really good in theory, but is actually difficult to get executives on board with?
Yeah, it's such a great question. And I think, as many of the HR professionals on the phone listening in can relate to, sometimes the things that are the most common sense are the most difficult to get that buy-in and to make that connection. It's something that we all need to be asking ourselves when we're considering what initiatives we can take on, and prioritization is a huge part of the conversation. I'd be remiss to not acknowledge achieving culture alignment isn't easy, even in stable conditions, or when you have the advantage of everyone being together in the same physical locations. It requires broad cross-functional and executive support. And it's not one of those things that you can just launch it and leave it. These are living, breathing, dynamic parts of any organization. But one thing I'd like to encourage everyone to think about as we have this conversation is whether or not your organization chooses to prioritize culture continuity doesn't change the fact that it will be the primary controllable factor that's going to distinguish who thrives and who struggles. And hopefully this conversation will actually help support those business conversations that many of you are having and will continue to have, because history will repeat itself. And the level of culture continuity you can demonstrate in these coming months and over this next year will deeply shape how the organization is going to move forward with this. The good news, in case Brie and I have made some of you feel, incredibly sad about this topic, is that the steps to get to culture continuity are actually fairly straightforward. And they're likely things you're already thinking about. In many cases, they may be things you're already doing. The first step comes down to reinforcing and amplifying your values. We talked about this a little bit earlier. And one really simple way to do that is through regular employee recognition. The second step is about elevating your employee listening strategy, really making sure that the voice of your employees are being heard across all levels of the organization. And last but definitely not least is to ensure that we're building a virtual culture hub to centralize employee programs and resources.
Yeah, and this is not to say it's an exclusive list. One thing that I think, in terms of the first steps in fostering culture continuity, HR needs to come to terms with the uncomfortable truth that having your values plastered on a wall or printed in an employee manual isn't enough to bring them meaning or infuse them into people's daily decisions and behaviors. The only way to truly integrate your values in the flow of work for employees is through regular values-based recognition. It's been said that the benefits of recognition have been studied to death. And it's true. Recognition has unequivocally proven to be the most scalable and effective way to align employees to key behaviors, improve morale, and is widely considered to be one of the strongest, most reliable drivers of employee engagement. However, when it comes to measuring the success of recognition efforts, an interesting dichotomy exists that not enough people acknowledge. And that's, although most organizations have some kind of recognition initiative in place, only 18% claim their program is definitely working. Even more concerning is the 82% of employees who say they don't feel adequately recognized. The disconnect can be explained by the fact that although for the most part recognition does have net positive effects, not all recognition is created equal. Research spanning from consulting houses to academia shows that for recognition to move the needle on engagement and actually impact value alignment, it has to have a few particular characteristics. Having deployed hundreds of recognition programs with some of the world's largest, most complex organizations, we call these characteristics the 3 golden rules of employee recognition. Let's delve into each one of these a little more closely, starting with the fact that recognition must be inclusive, meaning it should be democratized and free-flowing from the bottom up, side to side, and all directions, not just unidirectionally from the top down. Exclusively top-down people initiatives didn't work in pre-COVID workplaces, and they're not going to work now. employees should be able and encouraged to recognize anyone, regardless of their physical location, function, or job level. Enabling inclusive recognition also means making it transparent. So peers and managers can get direct line of sight into what's working so they can double down on those behaviors. We have a saying that what gets recognized gets repeated, but the science shows what gets recognized, especially in a transparent way, really gets repeated. Furthermore, leaders need to acknowledge that when employees might be feeling isolated or stressed due to changes or even reductions in staff, centralizing and amplifying those positive moments allows everyone to virtually celebrate in those wins, big and small, which bolsters morale and instills confidence in employees that the business is headed in the right direction.
I think that that mantra really sticks with me every time I hear it, that what gets recognized in a transparent way really gets repeated. And you see that, I'm sure many of you see that in your daily lives, both at home and at work. When we think about the golden rules of recognition, it's important to move to the second one, which has to do with the specificity of the recognition. And again, I think if everyone took a moment to think about the last recognition they received, the last praise, thank you, et cetera, and tie it back to, could you tie that back to what that was for? The more specific a recognition is about, that the exhibited behavior deserves to be recognized, the stronger the emotional impact will be on the receiver and their performance. If you think about it for a second, if I were to say to you, thanks for being awesome, that might make you feel really great, but you would probably also start thinking, oh, well, what did I do that was awesome? Why is she saying thank you to me? Why is she saying thank you to me right now? So saying that thanks for being awesome, it's great to put that out there, but it isn't as meaningful or as convincing. And the science shows that it doesn't lead to improved employee performance because employees aren't sure what that was for. So how would they know to repeat that? It's important that when we're giving recognition, we're really explicit about the behavior, the value and how it ties back to the organization's values and our strategic goals, especially in times of high stress, when employees might be wondering whether their job even matters. It's even more critical to guide them to see the connection of how their contributions, their daily work and the impact that they're having, how those can overall impact the organization's mission and purpose.
Yes, and I would love a very specific recognition from you, Vanessa, when we're done kidding.
You got it.
That kind of brings us to our final pillar of the three golden rules, which has to do with the frequency of recognition. And if there's one thing you take away from all of this, please let this be it. Recognition simply doesn't work unless it's frequent. Recognition doesn't help reinforce behaviors or improve engagement unless it's being received regularly. In fact, absolutely nothing in life works unless it's regular. Training a puppy, learning a new language, you would never exercise 5 times a year and expect bodily transformation. Recognition is no different. All the wonderful benefits of recognition are sadly a lot shorter lived than leaders previously assumed. Recognition is a short-term need that has to be satisfied on an ongoing basis.
Yeah, it's funny. One of our customers said to me recently that they've started a campaign internally to make recognition a daily habit. And the campaign essentially tied back to brushing your teeth. So you would brush your teeth multiple times a day. And that's how to think about how often and how important recognition is. It's interesting because when you look at what happens in the brain, and I kind of get pretty geeky about some of this stuff, but when someone receives recognition, 2 things take place. First, there's a little hit of dopamine, which results in that emotional high and contributes to creative problem solving, the sense of belonging we were talking about earlier with our friend Maslow. But the second thing is poof, it goes away almost as quickly as it happens. And so after analyzing nearly 2 decades worth of data across hundreds of companies, the Achievers Workforce Institute has found that organizations that average at least one unique recognition received per employee per month experience the strongest measurable impacts on business outcomes, whether that takes the form of customer service scores, employee retention, productivity, safety, the list goes on. And so we recommend and we work with our customers to set KPIs that ensure that recognitions per employees we're looking at those on a monthly basis, not an annual basis. So if one recognition per month, maybe some of you are thinking, wow, one recognition per month per employee sounds pretty expensive. You should know that it's truly impossible to reach these optimal recognition levels, the ones where you're going to get the biggest impact, without decoupling rewards from recognition. So they're seen in the eyes of your employees as two separate things. We sometimes talk to our customers and their leadership teams about recognizing the journey and rewarding outcomes, and knowing that recognition is part of your regular thing, and it's not the same thing as a reward. There have been tons of studies from MIT to the London School of Economics that support the idea that motivating employees through pushing incentives and rewards actually can have a weak exchange rate with today's knowledge worker. And it tends to create cultures of entitlement where employees start to really expect these rewards.
Yeah, it's true. If the end goal is to align employees to core values in a meaningful way and have a sustaining impact on engagement and performance, recognition strategy has to be centered around frequent, non-monetary peer recognition. Even without looking at the neuroscience and all the studies that show how powerful non-monetary social recognition can be on performance, it's common sense. Like, if Vanessa recognizes me in a way that's authentic and meaningful and my peers see it, I'm going to be energized and motivated to repeat that type of behavior, which is why the Workforce Institute recommends over 50% of all recognitions flowing through a particular organization to be free of reward. Now, I want to talk really quickly about how the 3 golden rules kind of play out in the real world. The Workforce Institute did a simple cross-comparison of 2 different recognition programs, both from publicly available case studies. And each company has around 70,000 employees. Both recognition programs were launched 3 years ago. The big thing that doesn't make this a perfect apples-to-apples comparison is that Company A is a grocery retailer while Company B is a pharmaceutical company. And this is relevant because retail is inherently a high turnover business. And without addressing the specifics, let's just say that Company A has well over 100% higher turnover than Company B. The other key difference is that Company A's employee base is offline, meaning they're not sitting in front of a computer all day, while Company B has more of an online employee base. And we happen to know from our benchmark data, which again accounts for hundreds of organizations around the world, that the combination of having a high turnover business with offline employees does tend to result in somewhat lower program usage. So right out the gate, Company A is at a bit of a disadvantage, but when we look at actually how the programs performed, what we find is a little surprising.
Thanks for outlining that for us, Brie. When I first saw the raw data from these case studies about these programs, 2 things jumped out at me straight away. The first was that both organizations are really embracing our first 2 golden rules, somewhat to varying degrees, but they're both focused on ensuring that their recognitions are inclusive and specific. But the most notable difference was really evident when I started looking at the deployment of the 3rd pillar around fostering the culture where employees get recognized frequently with less of that reward emphasis that we were just talking about, so the non-monetary piece. Company A really centered their strategy, and likely for good reason, especially when you think about budgets and in that sector, on driving frequent non-monetary peer recognition. So much so that they actually didn't even introduce rewards or any type of incentive to their program for the first year. So the program was really grounded in that non-monetary basis. And today, 63% of all recognitions that flow through Company A's program are non-monetary in nature, while Company B adopted a more traditional approach of focusing on rewards, and they averaged 36% peer-to-peer recognition, which in the case study discussed how it included both monetary and non-monetary recognitions. The difference in this philosophy of valuing regular meaningful recognitions versus valuing the rewards can really be seen most clearly in the fact that the average employee at Company A receives around 7 recognitions per month, while the average employee at Company B receives less than a third of 1 recognition each month, or about 4 recognitions a year. So Company A, despite being at the disadvantage you called out earlier with high turnover nature of their business and having their employees offline, they experienced literally 10 times more recognition moments over the course of 3 years than Company B. Really interesting stat.
I love this comparison because it's so simple, and it tells the story that it doesn't matter if you have a high turnover business or lots of field employees. Fostering a culture of appreciation that's centered around authentic, regular recognition is totally attainable for everyone. So, in summary, when thinking about how to create an engaged, connected workforce, remember that not all recognition is created equal. To achieve culture continuity and truly embed your values into the flow of work for employees, recognition has to be inclusive, specific, and most importantly, frequent. If you're averaging less than 1 recognition per employee per month, there's probably some opportunity to adopt a strategy that's less reward-centric and leveraging the power of non-monetary recognition. And as a way to give back to the HR community, Achievers is offering free electronic appreciation cards so you can practice the 3 golden rules of appreciation to thank your coworkers or your friends or family, and it can be accessed through the resources window in the upper left-hand side. But please don't go just yet, because we're about to talk about the second step of strengthening culture continuity, which has to do with embracing listening best practices. But before we dive in, we want to make sure that you're more engaged than this cute little guy. And we're going to do our first poll question. We want to see where you're at in your employee listening journey. So prior to the COVID-19 outbreak, how often were you conducting employee engagement surveys? Have you, A, not formally measured engagement? Yes. Have you been doing it on average once every other year or less, or once or twice a year, more than 2 times a year, or you're not really sure? Maybe you're new, or this is not your area. Please don't be that person who's too cool to answer the poll question. We want to hear from everyone. And keep in mind, what we're asking is what you were doing prior to COVID. So I will give it just another minute to make sure that it pops up on your screen before we take a look at the results. And let's see what you have to say. Oh, okay. A little surprising. So about 27% haven't taken the measures to quite start an engagement measurement strategy yet. Totally cool. Another 27% once every other year or less. 32%, which is our biggest group, are doing it once or twice a year. 8% are overachievers doing it more than 2 times a year, and 5% not really sure.
It's great to see that the vast majority of all of you are already listening to your employees in different ways. So really, really encouraging to see that. Looking forward to talking more about that.
Yeah, and it's good that most people have something in place, because it really is, listening to employees is a fundamental component of any comprehensive employee engagement strategy, and organizations with well-executed approaches to listening have been shown to consistently outperform their peers. But Vanessa, I know that employee voice has been widely talked about since the pandemic, and at this point, it's clear that when workplace anxiety is heightened and people are operating in VUCA, that is uncertain and disruptive conditions, it's even more critical for employees to feel heard. Obviously, as we just saw from the poll, most of our listeners already have an engagement strategy in place, but I'd love for you to share some considerations HR can use to gauge whether their current listening approach is optimized for this post-COVID workplace that's increasingly digital and fast-changing.
Yeah, absolutely. A big focus of the Workforce Institute's research has been around employee listening, especially since the onset of the pandemic, although we have been focused on the voice of the employee for quite a few years now. And as we talked about earlier, although each organization is unique and is approaching their recovery from their own lens, there are some universal recommendations that can be applicable regardless of where each organization may be. The first one, and this may be tough for some organizations to subscribe to, is that nothing annual is really working right now. This is true with whether we're talking about recognition. We just talked about frequency and the importance of it there. Performance management, that's another hot topic right now across all of HR, and measuring engagement. The truth is that the world is just moving too fast for anything annual to be truly effective. And if the end goal of listening to your employees is ultimately trying to cultivate resilience, increase employee engagement, or use feedback as a way to navigate change or remove obstacles that your frontline employees are facing, checking in, with employees only once or twice a year may not cut it.
Yeah, and I think at this point, it's become more difficult to argue the alternative. Even when you look at what's been happening in the market the last few years, it's clear that companies have been increasingly shedding their annual survey in favor for tools better suited for the modern workplace. In fact, last year, Gartner predicted that by the end of 2020, 80% of companies will either replace or augment their annual engagement survey with solutions that allow for more frequent collection and analysis of the data. I'm curious to see what the over-under will be on that prediction due to COVID. But really, the only two controversial questions that exist around listening best practices are, what's the best way to complement, augment, or replace an annual engagement survey? And what are the most effective tools and strategies to ensure that feedback results are translated into action? And Vanessa, I know that these are things you get asked about a lot. Would love to get your thoughts, starting with what the right frequency looks like if it's not once or twice a year.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I have the privilege, as I stated earlier, to talk to a lot of HR leaders. And these are wonderful people who know what they should be doing. They know that they should be doing something other than an annual engagement survey, but they're not exactly sure what that needs to look like, or if their organization is ready for the change management and work that comes with that. Sometimes that can feel really daunting. Kind of like what you were saying earlier, Brie, about, we all know we should exercise and drink tons of gallons of water a day, but that doesn't mean we necessarily do that. So I think when we're thinking about engagement measurement, it's really helpful to first define the various categories. And we're all familiar with the fact that for the last 15 to 20 years, most companies administered a traditional engagement survey. And, we heard that from our audience today. Around 2012 or maybe 2013, it became evident that things are changing too quickly on the front lines for annual surveys to be effective as a standalone channel. They definitely have a place, but we're talking about the standalone piece of it. And there were other issues. One of them is that by the time the data is collected and reviewed, it often is already dated or old, and it can be irrelevant for the managers to be looking at that point in time. And so, numerous vendors started surfacing with more frequent quarterly pulse surveys. And, over the past kind of 4 or 5 years since then, we've seen the emergence of continuous listening tools, things that are more always on, that are really analyzing employee sentiment, employee mood in between those quarterly pulse surveys. These can act as a weekly or even sometimes daily engagement tracker. And really what their purpose is to try and alert an organization to the trends that employees are feeling or concerns that they might have on the front lines in real time, almost like a canary in the coal mine, so to speak. Most organizational development experts will agree that the best practice is to deploy 2 or more of these strategies. And I'd say that most of our customers take our recommendation and they're conducting pulse surveys throughout the year. They're leveraging the always-on listening tool to get visibility to the issues that could arise between surveys, especially with everything that's going on right now.
Yeah, I like the canary in the coal mine analogy. I usually say that the always-on listening tool helps HR and managers see the smoke before the fire, but I like the canary in the coal mine.
Great.
Now, it's the other kind of big missing piece here I want to chat about real quickly has to do with the lack of action, and particularly manager action. Vanessa, tell us a little bit about your opinions on this.
Yeah, this is such an important topic because, we talk so much about listening and making sure employees feel heard. But at the end of the day, listening is really only half the battle. It's the first step. And in order to truly listen and to truly feel heard, we want to ensure that we take action. We know that when leaders and managers have the right tools to take ownership of building that team culture where the feedback is shared and it gets acted upon, it can be truly transformative for engagement and performance levels. In our 2020 engagement and retention report, the findings actually showed that one of the best ways to make employees stop participating in surveys and feel like they don't really matter, and in fact creating disengagement, which goes against the whole purpose, is to routinely fail to act on feedback. We often think that there's no such thing as survey fatigue, but a lot of employees suffer from inaction fatigue. And if your tools and processes aren't fundamentally centered around empowering leaders and managers to systematically react to what employees share, then you've lost the battle before the survey even goes out.
Yeah, and one analogy I heard that I think is a great demonstration of this point is, say your house is on fire and I approach you and I'm like, hey, I have this product that will tell you all kinds of information about the fire, which rooms are really burning, which areas are less affected, where the fire started. You would tell me to get out of your face and either give you a fire extinguisher or help you figure out what to do to put that fire out. Understanding the characteristics of a fire or how engaged your employees are doesn't actually help you or your frontline managers figure out what to do to address it. And we at Achievers learned this firsthand back in 2012, about a year after releasing our first listing product, and we were conducting focus groups to figure out what customers liked, where they wanted improvements, and most of them shared the sentiment that, yeah, it's great to have real-time visibility in what's happening on the front lines. We've gotten in front of some situations that maybe could have snowballed, but we're struggling to figure out how to make sure managers actually do something with all this feedback they're getting.
Yeah, it's so true. And, at that time, we embarked on this journey for the last few years where we've been building and iterating on the product so that we ensure it's firmly rooted in the latest academic research and centered around closing that gap so that managers have a guide to translate the data into very simple micro actions that they can solve for the unique engagement issues of their group, especially before they become, larger. I will say, our product is only one of many on the market, and I'm biased in terms of my opinion of it being the best, but that's definitely not the only option for all of you. The biggest takeaway here is if your current setup isn't heavily focused around empowering managers to take these simple and easy steps to close the feedback loop, we want to help you focus on that extremely important step through this knowledge we're sharing today.
Yes. And I think that we will go ahead and kind of summarize this second step, that this is the time to assess whether your listening strategy and tools are optimized for this new world of work. It's necessary to examine if you're listening frequently enough and how effective your current tool belt is at ensuring employee feedback is being reacted on regularly. If you're falling short in this area, you're missing the whole point. And Vanessa, I think that we have a special giveaway for our listeners today.
As we said earlier, change can be really hard. Even good change is hard. So as a way to thank everyone for tuning in, and in partnership with one of North America's leading HR consultants, we are happy to offer free readiness consultations with our experts who can help assess your company's listening strategy, your goals, and provide you with free practical tips you can take away, regardless of the technology, regardless of anything else, to really help you close the gap. So the link to redeem the offer will be in the resources tab, and that will be good for all of 2020. And this brings us to the final step in fostering culture continuity, which is, it's a tactical step, but it's incredibly important because it ties all of this together. And it has to do with that earlier concept we discussed around building that virtual culture hub.
Yay! Okay, I'm excited for this one. Before we kind of dig into the how, I want to quickly address the why. And for the last 10 years, thought leaders have been describing the future of work, this mystical, futuristic workplace where human connection revolves around technology. But thanks to COVID, there is no future of work. It's here. This is it. And the ensuing digital transformation we've been warned about, that was already in motion even before the pandemic hit, is about to be expedited at unprecedented speeds. We're all familiar with the fact that the absorption of culture has relied on being in the same physical space. And the reality HR needs to own up to is the old ways of doing things in a purely office-centric environment are over. Whether you're currently working on accelerating your work-from-home strategies for the long term or easing back into the office, this is the time to reimagine how you engage your people and disseminate your culture virtually. Going back to the employee experience model we shared earlier, most elements of the cultural component of a person's experience at work will now require a technological counterpart. Everything from water cooler conversations to celebrating birthdays, we're going to see a magnificent collision of the cultural and technological layers to the employee experience. And what this means for HR is your tech stack of employee-facing technology is going to grow. And it's imperative to think through how your employees will access it and all the ad hoc tools, portals, resources, and initiatives. So Vanessa, I'd love for you to share some practical tips HR can keep in mind as they look to either build a virtual culture hub or think about how they can enhance what they already have so it's optimized for these new working conditions.
Yeah, awesome. And in the interest of time, I'll try and keep this really brief. So it essentially comes down to, there's a lot of different solutions and approaches you can take to build a culture hub. And from my experience, two things to keep in mind are making sure that it's a place employees actually want to go and making sure that it's super easy to access and use. So, on the first one, creating that space where employees want to go, not have to go, thinking about adoption because the other consideration is irrelevant if you're not getting it right. Some organizations have intranets that can be static or, they have heavy compliance programs where people feel like they have to go there. When you get that solution where employees truly want to go there, you'll see incredibly high active usage, and that's something that you can take advantage of as you drive people there for a variety of reasons.
Yeah, absolutely. You're not Kevin Costner. Just because you build it doesn't mean they will come. Really, what we recommend is that 50% monthly active usage. We have customers that see 60% weekly active usage. And again, it doesn't have to be a recognition program. It could be Workplace by Facebook, a wellness hub. In fact, let's talk about the second tip, which is.
So this one's about really making sure that it's as easy as possible for people to use. Digital natives will comprise 75% of the entire workforce by 2025, which, by the way, is only 5 years away. And having clunky technology that often might be made more for HR administrators instead of employees just isn't going to cut it. We need to make sure that there's integrations that are happening and that the login and access piece is really easy and simple to use to keep things in the flow of work for your employees.
Exactly. And it should mirror the types of apps people want to use in their spare time and be mobile enabled so employees can access it anytime, anywhere. I wish we had more time to chat about this, but we'll wrap it up with some key takeaways before we pass it over to Mike to make sure that you know how to get credit for attending today's program. So today we explored what culture continuity is and why it's so paramount in these conditions. We walked through some steps of building it, and which include reinforcing your values, bringing them to life through regular recognition that abides by the 3 golden rules, and stepping up your employee listening game so it's appropriate for this new, rapidly changing world we live in, and designating a virtual culture hub to centralize employee programs so you maximize visibility and participation of culture and compliance initiatives. Just as a quick reminder, please check out the resources window for some of our giveaways, which include readiness consultations. I saw a question about what questions should we be asking. We're also giving away a free copy of our Achievers Critical Events Survey that you can turnkey use to ask those key questions. And lastly, please feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn and give me the gift of your feedback. I want to hear from you. I'd love your thoughts about today or what adjustments your HR team is making due to COVID. I reply to 100% of my questions or my messages, and they always make my day. Here's some questions to kind of leave you with as Mike kind of rounds out our discussion for today.
All right, thank you. We are going to be bringing our program to a close, but please hang on as we have a couple of final announcements, including information on the PDC that you earned. SHRM thanks Achievers for sponsoring this program and SHRM's series of free webcasts. Achievers is an employee voice and recognition platform that's been partnering with companies around the world to elevate their employee engagement strategies for the last 19 years. Achievers leverages the science behind behavior change so your people and your organization can experience sustainable, data-driven business results anywhere in the world. For more information, visit achievers.com. Before we sign off, a couple of final thanks. First to our presenters, Vanessa Brangwyn and Brie Harvey from Achievers. Thank you for the insight you shared. And we want to thank our audience for joining in and for choosing SHRM for HR Webcasts. That concludes today's program.